Okay, hi everyone. All right, so today we're going to try to finish up the various labor topics so that we can talk about credit next time. So to remind you guys where we were at the end of last class, we were talking about labor supply, and I want to talk about sort of a bunch of different issues about sort of people's labor supply decisions. So the first thing that I wanted to talk about was this idea that basically if people have less ability to smooth, that's going to make their labor supply less elastic, okay? And the consequence, this is what I talked about kind of at the end of last lecture, right, is that if we're in a world where this is labor demand, if we have a world where we have like, say relatively elastic labor supply compared to if we have relatively inelastic labor supply, and we have a given labor demand shock, that the inelastic labor supply is going to basically mean that wages are going to fall more than if we're in a world with more elastic labor supply. That's pretty intuitive. But what that sort of means is that there's an externality from sort of living around a bunch of other people who are inelastic, right? So conditional on what you're doing, if everyone else around you is inelastic, that means that those shocks are going to potentially hurt you more through this kind of wage channel. And that's what sort of Jaya Chandran wants to examine in her paper, okay? So what she's going to do is she's going to look, so in general, like this would be familiar to you, but in case it's not, if you want to estimate the slope of the labor supply equation, you need an instrument for labor demand, right? That's that's the basic idea. So so she's going to use rainfall shocks as an instrument for labor demand, and then she's going to basically estimate this sort of this regression over here, which is basically so she'd like to sort of have A is some sort of measure of labor demand, and S is sort of some ability to smooth. And so the question is sort of how does the people's ability to smooth, how does that affect kind of the responsiveness of wages to the labor demand shock, right? So it's an interaction effect. And just one thing to note, whenever you see these interaction equations, if you have control variables X, you also have to include the control variable interacting with sort of the variable of interest, right? Because if you just include the control variable, like the way to think about it is kind of we think that say S, our ability to sort of like smooth shocks or whatever, may not be randomly assigned. Say poor rural districts or whatever may have less ability to smooth. If we didn't and just controlling for the fact the district is rural doesn't really help. We need to control for the fact the district is rural interact with the same shock, right? Because only once we do that do we sort of get the interpretation that sort of this interaction is kind of residualized after controlling for this variable. So whenever you have, I just wanted to mention that because that's a kind of a pretty common mistake that we often see is that people will say, oh, I have some variable I'm interacting. I am concerned that it's, potentially correlated with other things. I'll include those things as controls, but you also need to include the controls interacted as well. So I just wanted to mention that. The other thing that sometimes comes up, which I just wanted to mention, is what do you do if you're instrumenting for a variable with an interaction, right? So in this case, like we'd like to say the endogenous variable, say, is productivity or output or what labor demand is or productivity or output. We're instrumenting with this with a rainfall shock. So like, what do you do if you're interested in the interaction, right? And the answer is that you create interactions with the instrument and the endogenous variable. So in this case, she's going to have, say, 3 endogenous variables. AT, SJT times AT, and XJT times AT, and she'll have 3 instruments: rainfall shock and the interaction of rainfall shock with this variable of interest, kind of your smoothingness, and with the X variables. Okay, so that's not magic or whatever, but I remember sort of certainly being confused about how do you do that when I was in your shoes, so I wanted to point that out. Clear? Questions? Okay. All right. So then substantively, what's the point? What does she show? Well, the first thing she's going to show is she's going to show a first stage, right? So that in general, kind of the rainfall shock does lead to more. Rainfall shock is defined as 1 if it's like good rainfall, 0 if it's average rainfall, and -1 if it's bad rainfall. So positive is like better rain. So positive rain basically does lead to kind of more crop yield, and more crop yields, and it does kind of lead to higher agricultural wages. Okay, so that's kind of the IV estimate right there. So then what she can basically do is she can then look at sort of whether or not these are then, with instrumenting for the crop yield with the rainfall shock. Oh, sorry, I should say, by the way, this is and this has district fixed effects and time fixed effects. This is kind of a normal kind of difference in difference kind of progression, right? So this is identified using the fact that different districts have different rainfall shocks at different periods of time. So it's only going to work kind of in a big country like India, where sort of it's big enough that you have sort of different rainfall shocks in different places over time. So, so what do you find? Basically, she finds that in general, she finds kind of that so she has several different measures of sort of ability to smooth shocks. One is whether you have access to banking. One is whether you have different sort of access to sort of ability to sort of migrate and go to other areas like railway service or bus service or things like that. The other is sort of whether people are just poorer, with the idea that sort of being poor also might make you kind of closer to this consumption floor and therefore make you have less elastic. And all these interactions are negative, which basically means that the labor demand which is basically consistent with this idea that the labor supply curve is less elastic. Is more elastic. In places that have more ability to smooth. Sorry, Wes, you look confused. Is that clear? Right. So the wage effect is smaller, right? So if just going back here, the wage effect is going to be smaller in places where we have more elastic demand, and she's basically finding that basically the wage effect is smaller in places that have kind of more access to banking, more access to other areas, or sorry, these are the two I want to mention. Where more access to banking and more access to areas. Sorry, so more ability to smooth. Sorry, that's right. This one actually, I think, less on sort of poverty, actually. Less on poverty. Okay, so that was sort of that was one point I wanted to make about labor supply. A second point I wanted to make about labor supply is kind of a recent paper by our colleague Frank Schilbach and some co-authors on whether or not poverty has a direct effect on your ability to be productive through kind of a behavioral channel. So I don't remember how much Esther talked about this in the sort of poverty trap section, but one of the ideas of poverty traps is that poverty could make you less productive through a nutrition channel, right? If you can't kind of eat enough to sort of get enough calories to actually sort of work hard, that may make you earn less, and that can kind of lead to a poverty trap. And some of the original poverty traps had this kind of nutrition channel. A more recent idea is that there may be a cognitive relationship between poverty and productivity, and therefore your ability to earn, that could also kind of have similar kind of poverty trap implications. So this paper is not going to actually argue that there's necessarily a poverty trap, in the sense that it doesn't sort of say this elasticity is large enough to sort of generate multiple equilibria, but it is going to sort of look at whether or not there is a relationship between your cognitive concerns about poverty and productivity. And I just want to remember, Frank did not teach this paper during the behavioral section, right? No? Okay, good. I just had a thought of oh my gosh, am I repeating myself? Or repeating ourselves? Okay. So the question, though, and what's kind of tricky about this paper is how do you distinguish between a cognitive channel and actual kind of just overall kind of being poorer? So what they want to do is they want to really isolate between So let me explain more kind of what they do, okay? And in particular, what they're going to do is they're going to so let me explain that in a second. One thing I want to note about this paper is sort of a different style of research than a lot of the other papers we see, and it's a style that I feel like I've seen a lot of in the last kind of 5 years or so, and so it's something that people are increasingly doing. So I sort of wanted to mention it and sort of get your thoughts on it. So in some sense, what they're doing here is they're going to create their own workplace where basically they control everything, okay? It's not like a lab, right? It's more kind of real world than a lab. They're going to bring people in. They're going to sort of hire them to do real tasks. They're going to kind of work there for a month. They're going to pay them real wages. So it's not just sort of like a lab setting where you're sort of bringing in, whoever for a few hours to do some kind of very manipulative task. But it's also not quite kind of like, operating things in a totally naturalistic environment either. But the advantage of this is that they completely control like everything about kind of this condition because it's their workplace, right? So they're the employer, and so they can kind of fine-tune everything with kind of the level of control that you would have in a lab. And there are a bunch of, I think, a number of papers, I think, recently, some by various versions of this co-author team and their collaborators, which have, but also by others. Like, for example, we had a job market candidate from here a couple years ago, Josh Dean, who's now a professor at Chicago, who did a study of the impact of noise, for example, on people's productivity, and that was sort of a similar setting where he sort of brought people in, taught them a task. They had to like sew pockets on shirts, I think, for example, and he was able to vary kind of how noisy or quiet the room was and look at their productivity. So it's a style of research that I think that people are increasingly doing, and I just wanted to make sure you're sort of aware of that. Let me just tell you more about what they do, and then you can sort of think about what the pros and the cons of this are. So the empirical test of what they're going to do is they're going to vary the timing of when your wages are paid, holding the NPV of your earnings fixed. Okay, so they're going to just be timing kind of like how your productivity responds to a liquidity infusion without changing your overall earnings. Okay, so here's what I mean. Okay, so here's what they do. So they have two different groups that come in. They have like a control group and a treatment group. They have people come in. They sort of have them make these plates for some period. Then they have an announcement of sort of like when the payment schedule is going to be. And in the two different treatments, what they just vary, so this is, I guess, a 2-week kind of treatment, they vary sort of whether or not they get some fraction of the payment kind of here on day 8, or they have to wait for all of it on day 12. And the kind of interest is going to be sort of how this affects their working behavior in kind of this intermediate period. And so the theory is that people are sort of people who are really worried about money are going to be relieved of some of their concerns. The ones in this group, are going to be relieved about some of their immediate concerns about sort of how do we handle kind of our liquidity issues, right? Kind of right here. And if that was sort of like, if those kind of concerns were sort of weighing on their mind, that might sort of lead to an increase in productivity. Okay, so that's the idea. Is that clear? Okay, so and they're going to change this. They're going to compare this. One thing that's also nice is they're going to compare this effect to a change in the piece rate. So they're going to pay you per plate made or whatever. They'll also vary the piece rate so they can benchmark, how big is this change in timing effect to sort of something that we more normally know how to think about, which is just sort of how would people respond to sort of changes in the wage rate. And that's also, I think, a nice feature. Like, there's a lot of papers that have this view of like we're testing something, and we don't quite know how to put this parameter in a model. And so what we'll do is we'll also, in the same experiment, take something which we really do know how to interpret, and then we can at least sort of say, well, this thing is 3 times as large or 1/3 as large or whatever as the effect of a change in the wage rate. So we can use this kind of thing we know how to interpret to benchmark kind of, is this effect kind of big or small? So there are other papers that have done this too. There's a nice paper, for example, on that I remember from a while ago on credit, on sort of looking at sort of how this was a paper that looked at credit, I think in South Africa, and they sent out different flyers with like different kinds of images on it, like it's kind of a marketing campaign of like what's the impact of having someone with an image of the same race as you, or someone who's smiling, or no image, or a bunch, or some things like that, and like they get some effects of credit take up. And we'd like to know, like, are these effects kind of large or small? And so the way they sort of benchmark that is they also, in the same experiment, vary the interest rate on the loan. And they can say, well, then that allows them to say, well, the effect of, say, seeing a picture of someone who's the same race as you is, whatever it is. I don't remember the exact numbers. Say it's like half as big as the effect of the effect equivalent to a 2 percentage point change in the loan rate. I'm making up the numbers because I don't remember the exact findings of that study off the top of my head. But the point is that by also including that additional kind of like number we know how to think about, it lets you know whether these additional effects you're thinking about, which are kind of large or small. Yeah.
When would you not want that? Like you said, if you have very good benchmarks.
So I think some things are. If the thing you're studying is inherently kind of interpretable, I don't think you need it as much. For example, think about like the paper I was talking about like the what is the effect of paying people, of performance pay, for example, in the tax collector case. Like there it is kind of like we don't need anything else to do because that is kind of the benchmark. So lots of the things that we feel like we're studying, changes in interest rates, changes in wage, like some of those things are sort of more natural economic parameters, don't need kind of an additional benchmarking, I think, in the same way. But it's more for these cases where like the thing you're studying is like not obvious. Like if I gave you some number, you'd have no idea if it's big or small unless we knew how to compare it to something that we know more how to think about.
Yeah, I guess because it's an artificial setting as well.
It's not so much an artificial setting. If we did this in the real world, we still would have no idea. Like, suppose I did this and I told you that like paying you the liquidity effect, in advance. Suppose we did this in a real factory with like 1 million, 1,000 people or whatever, and so it wasn't this artificial setting. We still found that had an effect of 4 percentage points, 4% on their productivity. Like, what do you do with 4%? Like, is that like a big number or a small number? You kind of have no idea. Right? So in some sense, what the point of this additional benchmarking is to say is like it lets us sort of think about like is that number sort of big or small relative to other elasticities we know how to think about. Does that make sense? Yeah. So it's not so much as an artificial setting, it's more just sort of like or think of the noise example I was talking about before. Like we do a study where we basically sort of say we're gonna have people sew pockets on shirts, and we're going to do it in a really noisy room or a really small room, and we're going to suppose we found that like they sew 15% more pockets, when the room is quiet. Like what do you do with that number? Like you can reject it 0, so that's good, but like quantitatively, how do we think about is that effect kind of large or small? And I think that having an additional benchmarking thing like that can help you and sort of say, well, that's equivalent to, you'd have to how much is that worth in dollar terms? Well, it's worth like you'd have to pay them, say, whatever. Suppose you had to pay them 40% more to get the same amount of productivity. That's like a number that we can think about. You see what I'm saying? Or you could also say, like, for example, another thing you could do is you could say, well, what is the cost of like noise, for example, to the firm, and how does that compare to sort of the benefit? Other ways you could do this, get the same productivity for wages, for example. Sorry, someone else had a question.
Well, I think Frank did teach this paper.
What?
I do think Frank taught this.
This one?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, I said no.
Familiar from the time.
Huh?
The time.
Yeah,
Okay, great. Then I'm not going to go through it in as much detail. Okay, great. Okay, so then why don't I just skip it then? So, okay. Well, let me say a few things about it. Okay, then in that case, if Frank actually taught it in detail, let me not go through the results. Thank you for pointing that out before I spent too much time on it. Let me just note a couple of other things that I think are nice about their design. So they, in addition to this piece rate thing, they also show, they do 2 things. The first is this announcement thing allows you to sort of rule out this idea of gift exchange. So just the fact that like this is gonna, like it actually it's the actual payment that makes a difference, not knowing you're going to be paid. So I think that was sort of a nice design. And the other thing which is cool is like you might have, like one of the, I think the big concerns about this, at least what I would have, is maybe this is directly kind of affecting your productivity through the nutrition channel. So they actually measure kind of people's nutritional intake, for example. They measure their like breakfast intake, for example, as a way of sort of saying like, is there a direct effect on nutrition? And so I think that's one thing that's very nice about this is because they control so many like different levers here, they can think through kind of what are all the possible alternatives and sort of design things to take them into account. But if he covered this in detail, why don't I have a lot to cover today, so why don't I, unless people have other questions, I'll just skip the rest of it and move on. Okay. Okay, now I'm like, did he cover this paper too? Okay, good. All right. I was like, uh-oh. Okay, all right, so number one thing that affects labor supply is just in general your sort of ability to smooth. That makes you more or less elastic. The paper by Frank and co-authors sort of suggests that sort of your poverty levels can directly affect your productivity. This paper by Suanna Oh looks at sort of whether or not people have strong preferences over the kinds of jobs they do. And she does this in India, so that's a setting where I think, given sort of the caste structure, is going to be particularly salient. So, but she wants to look at sort of how much workers are willing to give up to avoid tasks associated with other castes. Okay, and does this matter if it's public or private? And so, I'll just say, I think this is something where, obviously India is a set, given sort of the very strong caste structure in India and the association of castes with particular kinds of jobs, this is probably maybe an upper bound for sort of how big these effects are going to be. It's hard to know think of other settings where this would be even more natural. But the fact that she finds this, I think, suggests that these ideas of sort of what is your identity and how much are you willing to pay to avoid tasks that are sort of not associated with your identity, suggests this can actually be pretty important. Okay, so what I also think, this is again another one of these similar settings where, like the previous paper, they're going to be sort of running the task. And so that's going to allow her to sort of control things in a fair amount of detail. So in this case, they're making paper bags for a fixed daily wage. And she asks, and in her case, she's going to add an additional task, which you also have to do. And the task is associated with either higher or lower castes. Okay? So she's going to vary both the task you have to do and the amount of time you have to spend on this additional task. So why do you think, by the way, she has this additional thing of like the amount of time? Why might she want to do that instead of just sort of varying just the amount of whether you have to do the task? Any ideas?
She estimate the cost function.
Yeah. So it's going to allow you to estimate the cost function. I think, and in particular, I think the idea is that if these are identity violations, then this might be kind of discrete in having to do the task and sort of not so much like linear in the amount of time. So like, I think this helps, if it's just really unpleasant, it might be kind of linear, right? But if there's something about like, I really don't want to have to, whatever the task is, work with leather, clean toilets, like whatever the task is, like maybe it may be just, there may be sort of this discrete, it may be sort of discrete in a jump. The others don't vary whether or not the tasks are made in public or done in private. And that's also because you might think that sort of your identity could be different in terms of whether it's internal, like I don't want to do this, or it's external, like others are going to see me kind of do this task. And so she's also going to vary that. She's also going to measure willingness to accept for the job using a BDM mechanism. I forget if that's been covered in this class or not. Okay, so what is a BDM mechanism? So this is a very common mechanism for eliciting people's willingness to pay, or in this case, willingness to accept. And the basic idea is this. So one thing I could do is I want to basically measure, say, a demand curve, right? Or supply curve. In this case, it's supply curve, but let's think of a demand curve, right? So I have some good, I want to measure your willingness to pay for like, a doodad, a clicker, for example, okay? So one thing I could do is I could just ask you how much you're willing to pay for the clicker. That's not so good because it may not be incentivized. We don't quite know what people are going to do. A better thing I could do would be to randomize price offers to people and randomize and go around the room and say, okay, Vishaan, I'm going to offer you the clicker for $5. Take it or leave it, yes or no. And then I'm going to go around and say, Kailash, I'm going to offer you for $5, and Ashana, maybe I'll offer you for $3, and so on and so forth. And I'll randomize kind of the prices across people, and I'll get sort of what is the fraction of people who are willing to pay $5, and the fraction of people who are willing to buy it for $4, and so on. And that's a demand curve, right? That's perfectly fine. There are two challenges with that. The first is it takes a lot of people, right? Because you're only getting one data point, which is the willingness to pay at a particular price for particular people, for a particular person. So I have to kind of go across everybody in order to measure that. The second problem is if I want to sort of like do regressions or whatever, I don't know kind of the, each individual I's complete willingness to pay schedule. I only know one data. Like maybe I happen to maybe I'm really interested in, for Vishaan, for example, I happen to give him a $20 price, and of course he's not going to pay $20 for this thing. So I don't really learn that. I mean, I do learn a piece of information about the demand curve, but if I want to run a regression with each individual's demand in it, I don't have, I'm a little short. So the Becker-DeGroot-Marshak mechanism basically works like this. It basically says, I want to know in advance, like if I offered you 10, would you buy it? If I offered you 9, would you buy it? If I offered you 8, would you buy it? And so on and so forth. I'll get your complete price schedule, and then I'm going to randomly pick one of those prices and implement that, and I will, and then we'll transact if you had said you were going to do it, and that's incentive compatible, right? Because the price I select is not a function. As long as the price I select is random, the price I'm selecting is not a function of your demand. So you may as well sort of tell me the truth for each price level. And it's incentivized because there's some probability that each price level is going to be come about, and therefore you may as well, like, you have an incentive to sort of to reveal the truth. Is that clear? So basically, the key point is you just elicit everyone's demand, each individual's demand at all the different price levels, and then you randomly pick one of them and implement that. Okay, it's not that hard, but that's what it is. And there's a paper actually by a number of our former graduate students from a bunch of years ago, showing that sort of like at least, I think they were selling like some kind of water filtration pot in, I think, Ghana. And they basically randomized whether they were going to get people's willingness to pay using this Becker-Marshall mechanism or just making a series of take it or leave it offers to different people, and they show that the demand curves look very similar. So I think it's a little confusing. It can be a little confusing to subjects sometimes, so you don't always do it. But that's what that is. It's okay. That's that. So what she's going to do is she's going to measure people's willingness to. So if it's demand, right, it's sort of willingness to pay. If it's supply, it's willingness to accept a price offer. So she's going to measure people's willingness to accept different sort of price offers for these different jobs, and then one of them will be randomly implemented. Is that clear? Okay. The other thing that she does is which is sort of, so she has a bunch of different casts. They have associated with different tasks. And then she also has these control tasks, which she tries to come up with a sort of like similar kinds of tasks that are similar in terms of what you actually have to do, but may not have kind of these strong caste connotations. So like, washing clothes is, I guess, associated with this particular, so this is not my area of expertise, but associated with this particular caste. Washing farming tools, basically, it's a similar kind of thing. You still have to go wash something, but it doesn't have this strong caste connotation. And she has a couple of other examples like that. And in some sense, the key point is sort of the take-up rate. So first of all, this is the take-up rate of the different tasks that are offered, and this is the number of minutes. So first of all, you can see the number of minutes slope is pretty flat. So it really looks like it's about kind of what task you're offered, not so much how long you have to do it. So that was kind of that identity point I was making before. It really looks like it's something about the task, not about the amount of time. And I mean, there's still downward slopes, but not very much. For the control tasks, kind of the higher ranked tasks, in general, are sort of the highest, and the middle and the lower ones. The ones that have these strong identity kind of connotations, people are very strongly sort of willing to take the task that is sort of more associated with their caste, and very unlikely to take kind of a lower ranked caste. And they're even sort of less willing to sort of accept a task that's considered associated with a higher ranked caste, even if it's not yours. So I think that and then so I just want to sort of mention that it seems like people are sort of willing to that this identity of sort of what kinds of jobs are associated with their identity seems to be sort of important in people's labor supply decisions. Yeah, Aaron.
There's a quick question. So you mentioned that she randomly varied whether the tasks that people were assigned was made public, but were the tasks themselves like publicly visible? Because I think in the pictures it seemed like some of them were being done indoors versus like, I don't know, like.
I don't remember, actually. That's a good question. I don't remember. She actually doesn't find much in the way of the public treatment doesn't make a big difference, but I don't remember what. I know it was announced that it was going to be public what you did, but I don't remember what the task level was public. Yeah, Hazel.
Why do we expect the left-hand graph to also be flat? Like, I get that the right-hand graph we expect it to be flat because it's like the identity tasks, but the left one, aren't they supposed to not be identity tasks, so we wouldn't necessarily expect it to be flat?
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a fair point, actually. I agree with you, actually. Now that I think about it, I don't have a good answer for that. So, sorry. But you're right. You would think that if the non-identity ones, by the argument I was making before, should be more downward sloping. So I take it back. I don't have a good answer for that.
Ben?
Yeah.
Just put really big, like, aggregate market implications, right? Like, I'm just thinking it sounds like a really bad form of misallocation of labor. Like you can only have, I suppose people are actually, you know.
Yes and no. So the first is, so if you think that sort of people's skills at these different, if you think these tasks are more or less interchangeable in terms of skills, then no. If you think there's really strong heterogeneity in skills across tasks, some people are really good at task 1, not really good at task 2, then yes. So I think it really depends on sort of how much there is substitutability in the underlying production function across these tasks. But it certainly could lead to large misallocation, but doesn't necessarily lead to it. Okay, the final thing I wanted to mention about labor supply is this new paper by Hussam et al., which is tackling kind of this, the broader question of sort of what is the like, you know, what is the sort of the psychological benefits are there psychological benefits of employment? Okay, so the typical model that we write down looks like this, right? It has some like utility over consumption and leisure, and consumption and labor in this where you know, labor enters negatively in the utility function, right? We prefer to spend more time at leisure, but we don't. But you know, but we have to work, and therefore we have to meet some consumption. So there's like a labor-leisure trade-off. And this paper is trying to ask, like, is that the right way to think about it? And in fact, there's some like stepping kind of stepping way back, there is some reason to think that actually, like, you know, there's other reasons to think that maybe this is not quite right. So if you look at sort of people's like happiness surveys, one of the strongest predictors of unhappiness is unemployment, for example. And you know, that's not, if you were to control for kind of income or consumption, that's actually a little hard to think about from like this like model, right? It's, you know, you would have the view that actually if you're like consuming a lot and you're unemployed and you have all this leisure time, like what's wrong with that? But it doesn't seem to be the way people are sort of behaving, and there may be this idea that actually sort of there are utility benefits from working. Okay, so she wants to sort of investigate this. Okay, and they're going to so what she's going to do is she's going to work in refugee camps. Okay, so that's like a sort of an unusual setting, and you can think about whether or not that setting is kind of relevant or not for the conclusions. And she's going to basically do randomize people into 3 things. So they're going to either get a job, and the job is basically going around the refugee camps, kind of doing surveys, doing survey work for 3 days per week for 2 months. A control group, which basically just gets a small fee to kind of fill out her surveys. Or their surveys, I should say, and a cash treatment, which is basically a large fee to fill out the surveys, where the fee from the survey is equal to the payment from the job arm. Okay, so thoughts on the design? So is the design clear? Thoughts on the design? Does this kind of get at her question, not get at her question? Yeah,
just to clarify, the idea for the control and cash is that the amount of time that it takes you to fill out the survey is like almost entirely negligible. Like it's not.
You mean, sorry, what do you mean?
Like, so the filling out of the survey in the control and cash groups is meant to be like not labor essentially. Right?
I'm sorry, I don't understand your question.
So the like the framework that we have in mind is that like spending your time on labor as opposed to leisure is something that like might be good, might be bad, and the control and the cash arms here, filling out the survey is like a short enough amount of time that we're not counting it as
work.
Labor.
Yes, exactly right. So this is like, okay, right. So exactly. So it's not work, right? So why the cash treatment?
Because one reason you might get utility from labor is because you earn income.
Exactly, right? So the cash treatment is super important, right? But we also want to sort of identify kind of the effects of the cash per se. So this is going to be the same as this is going to be the same task. So like, what do you have to do? Fill the survey. But we're going to sort of just vary the income, the income here. So these 3 things, they all have sort of like, you know, filling out surveys. So all of them, in addition to sort of doing the surveys, you also have to fill out the survey for her. So she gets the information from everybody. That's the same everywhere. And here you get just the cash, here you get the cash, but you have to work for it. Aaron?
How are they measuring utility? Like, what's the outcome?
I'll show you much better.
Okay.
Yeah.
Are these people from the same refugee camp?
Yes.
So that they can observe like, with the treatment of others?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I don't remember how big the camp is relative to the size of her experiment, but yes, you should be, like one thing you could be concerned about is sort of what is the effect of sort of like, you know, if it was large enough that other people could see what I was doing, that's something you could be concerned about. Sorry, someone else had a comment. Yeah.
Is there a purpose for the surveys? Like, are they told that the surveys are going to be used for something?
Yeah, I don't remember exactly what they are, but yes, they're told they have some use. They're going to be surveys for, you know, of people's status of what their work, whatever is. Yeah.
I'm going to assume that from the name of the paper that in the end they will find if they are given, if the refugees are given work, they are better off on some social dimension. Are the refugees aware of this effect ex ante? Like if they were asked to choose between these three options, which one would they?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't remember. That's a great question. I don't remember if she asked them ex ante, like if they asked their, Ed, you look like you were about to say that I've forgotten something. No, I don't remember her asking that question, but that's really interesting to know if they're aware of it. I don't know the answer to that question.
I guess maybe kind of related to Ahmed's point, like, given that this setting is pretty unique in refugee camps, like, I was thinking that cash may not have the same, like, mapping into consumption that might if you were just dropping cash into, like, people where, I don't know, I mean, I guess
Well, she can measure that, right? So she's actually going to look at sort of yeah, she'll look at some of the sort of the consumption effects actually, and so she'll sort of see, she'll be able to see if they're doing things differently. So we'll get to that in a sec. Yeah. But I think you guys are right. Like, so I think that one thing that's okay. So so I think that you're right. That sort of like this setting is potentially important, right? So one of the so why is she doing it in this setting? I think there's two reasons. One is actually this is a separate from sort of being a paper about employment. This is also a paper about like understanding kind of refugee camps, and I think that sort of there's a view like so it's of independent interest. Sort of how do we think about like what we should do with policy in refugee camps? I think that sort of the general view here that they're sort of arguing against in some sense is like we just need to sort of provide people with a basic income and not worry about kind of what they're doing with their time until we can get them to go somewhere else. And actually, she's sort of saying no. Actually, there may be important values of kind of what they're doing. Like that may actually have value in and of itself. So I think there's sort of substantive interest. The second is it may be sort of a setting where they can sort of do this experiment. So, but I think that and if you sort of see the way that the paper is presented, I think it very much embraces the view that actually understanding kind of how to design refugee camps is in and of itself like an important question of interest. On the other hand, though, it may not necessarily externally generalize in exactly the same way, and I think that's something to sort of keep in mind. Sorry, are there other questions? Oh, one other thing that you guys didn't mention, which I happen to think may be important, is it's also important to understand what the job is, right? So the idea is like it's a job, but like there are good jobs and bad jobs. There are, you know, if we just look at the previous paper, there are jobs that are pleasant and jobs that are unpleasant. There are jobs that are sort of, you know, make you feel good about what you're doing or bad about what you're doing. She could easily have imagined kind of a job that was sort of much less pleasant that may have had very different implications. That's number one. So it's the results are kind of conditional on the job she happened to have. So I think that sort of understanding that is an important detail. And the second point about this is, you know, one thing I think is a little less than ideal about a survey is what you actually do in a survey is you walk around and see everyone else's conditions. And so you're actually explicitly sort of being asked in some sense to compare like your own condition to sort of that of other people. And so I think that like if it was me, I would have tried to find it. I mean, it's so hard to know. Kind of, I'm sure they had a million constraints in designing the study, but if possible, it would have been nicer, I think, to have a job that didn't have this direct kind of like social comparison aspect to it. Because you know maybe people are just happier because they're looking around and saying, well, gee, you know, my life is terrible, but boy, your life is even worse. So actually, I'm kind of better off by comparison. So that's I think a little bit of a disadvantage of that. But the general point is it's important to just think through like what exactly is the treatment. Yeah, Hazel.
You also might think some of their like happiness would come just from being chosen, not from like doing the job. So you might want to survey them after they've been chosen. It's like even though it's randomly assigned, people might like feel good about having been given this job.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, totally. That's right. People's you could think of your identity as being affected just by the fact that you were chosen, and people don't fully understand random assignment. Even if you told them it was random, they might not fully sort of understand that. I agree with that. Yeah.
One thing that I hadn't thought of before, but once you're in a refugee camp, a substantial number of these people are already depressed, right?
Yeah. We have the depression. I don't think we have the depression number. I don't think we have it. I don't see the PHQ is I think the depression screen. I don't see this. I don't see the control mean there. So I don't know the answer to that. But yes, probably.
I mean, you left your home due to a war. I would assume that's not a nice place to be in.
Certainly not. Yeah. That is absolutely sorry. That is absolutely right. What the relationship between that and actual depression is just like an empirical question I don't know the answer to. But yes, certainly it seems plausible.
In that kind of a setting, like potentially anything that takes your mind off the memories of war. In this case, a job that like keeps you busy may actually be good for you, regardless of like not necessarily the value of the job per se, but like doing anything. Like I would give them games to play, and that would make them perhaps better off psychologically. Just from the causal channel thing, you are not thinking about the war if you are doing something else.
Yeah, I agree with you. So another thing that so again, you face a limited set of treatment choices, but I agree with you. Like that suggests that if she had more or they had more power, it would have been nice to add another treatment, which is sort of like cash plus some kind of entertainment. And by the way, the entertainment could be, but of course, you have to make choices when you're designing an experiment. So then you could have the question of should the entertainment be social or non-social? I could give you video games, or I could give you like, have you come together and play board games. Like, like what exactly is the, or whatever sort of the activity is. Like what is exactly kind of meaningful. So I think you're totally right that I think is a confound. I don't think we know what it is. I think and so I think that's absolutely right. I think, I don't think if I had to choose just 3 treatments, this is not a crazy set of things to choose. But I agree with you that like that could certainly be a channel. And by the way, if you ever get to the point where you're designing your own experiments, you will quickly come to realize that there are like way more treatments that you would like to run than you can. And part of kind of the challenge of experimental design is like picking what are the couple of things that I think are the most important that kind of get at this. And Ed's nodding, probably having tried to do this himself, I'm guessing. And so, I think that you quickly sort of end up in a world where like I certainly remember in experiments was designing, actually doing brainstorming, coming up with like, I don't know, 20 different things I could possibly try, and then you have to sort of narrow down to what is the ones that are both the capturing kind of the hypotheses that are most important, and if you have additional ones, like ruling out the most important kind of like counterfactuals. And in her case, I think the most important one was the cache. So I actually think this is not a crazy, not crazy. I think it's a very nice experimental design, but I think that other people may have made different trade-offs, and if she had more power or they had more power, like I think those could be additional things to think about. Yeah,
I
sure.
think sort of baked into like the, I guess like traditional way of thinking about it though is like, oh, if you have leisure and you want to like enter, like, I don't know, maybe it's like different when you're in a refugee camp, but like you can fill your time with leisure, but maybe it's like people don't actually know how to like structure their leisure time in a way that brings fulfillment, but jobs do bring fulfillment, and that's kind of like the thing she is testing. So I guess what I'm saying is I don't know that like this, I feel like that's kind of baked into the thing she's trying to project already.
Yeah, although I think that what Ahmed is saying is there's a distinction between I don't know how to fill my time and I'm explicitly conditioning my like income on doing a particular task, right? Like a job has 2 things. It has like something I have to do, and it has this conditionality of like I am doing this work and getting the money for it, as opposed to just getting the money for free. And so like, you know what I'm saying? It's a.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess No, maybe I don't. Maybe I don't know. I feel like I understand perhaps you're saying like or perhaps Ahmed is saying like the particular thing is like they like don't have anything to do in the refugee camp, but like I guess like I think that the idea that like the marginal utility of, or like that there's like utility to leisure and a disutility to labor is that like you can, I don't know, maybe is that you can fill your time with things like entertainment, and then if you also have the same amount of income, then like that would be best, and like if.
But that's I think what I'm saying is she's not teasing that out. You're saying that like because like I'm actually a little confused. Sorry,
Well,
you're basically saying you're basically saying in the refugee camp the problem is that like we can't fill our times with sort of and good entertainment. That was I think is Ahmed's point.
Yeah, that's what I agree, but that's not
Yeah.
my point.
Okay.
So I guess that's like, but I think that like, yeah, never mind.
No, I mean I guess I think these are subtle distinctions, and I think that sort of like I guess another way of saying it is like a job is kind of a bundle of things, right? And it's something to do. It is a particular thing to do, which is going around and sort of like taking surveys of other people. So it fills your time. It is this particular task. That task may have implications, and is conditioning your. It also means that you have to like work. It's conditioning kind of your income on a particular set of activities. It's at least those three things. It probably has other things too. And we're getting kind of the net effect of that bundle. And given sort of the effects she finds, it would be nice to sort of decompose that bundle kind of even further.
Right. I agree that the treatment Ahmed is proposing would provide additional insight into what it is about the job that provides it. But I guess what I'm saying is like in terms of the neoclassical theorists would still say that like
Job is negative.
Yeah.
Yes, I agree with that. Yeah.
Like in context like this.
Wait, sorry, no. Well, a job is negative, but no. The problem is that the utility function could have like three. It could have like consumption of material goods, chit-chatting with people, or organizing like what am I doing during my day, and that enters positive, and like work that I'd rather not do enters negative, and sort of those things are kind of like conflated. I think that's the sort of the point, right? No, you look unhappy with that.
I think I just didn't understand what you just said.
I'm just saying, like you could write a utility function which basically has like three terms. Like it has U of like C, which is like stuff you eat, stuff you consume. Let's call it like S, which is like social activity, and L, which is like work. Right, and like in general, like this might be plus and this might be plus and that might be negative, and the job kind of has some of this and some of this.
Right. I guess what I'm saying is that I would, the traditional way to think about it would be like, well, if you get something positive from social activities, you're going to go figure out how to do that when you have leisure. So like.
I see. Yes.
And so if you're not figuring out how to do that, that's like interesting. The fact that like you're not able to do things that make you happy with your leisure time, but that labor somehow provides those things.
Yes. Fine. Fair enough. The fact that those things are kind of coming bundled is already sort of a relevant point about a job. Yes, I agree with that. Okay. Other comments? One other thing that I'm going to mention is they pre-specify heterogeneity in a couple of respects on like looking at past exposure to violence, baseline sociability, and baseline depression. And there's a broad debate on sort of how much you should pre-specify on these things, but I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here. But one thing I just want to note is that whenever you're planning on cutting your results by some X variable or having an interaction, that's a case where sort of pre-specifying that interaction is really helpful. And the reason for that is if you run a treatment with like three different things, the main effect, there's only really so many ways you can run that regression. And one of the really nice things, having worked over my time with both randomized data and non-randomized data, one of the really nice advantages of working with randomized data is actually all the empirical specifications don't really matter very much. Like you run because the epsilons really are random. You can run this model, you can run that model, you can use this standard errors, that standard errors, you can include fixed effects, non-fixed effects, whatever. It's gonna maybe it'll affect your standard errors a little bit, but the basic answer is usually gonna be the same. So there's not so many ways to run a regression of like, I'm interested in depression, how do I, run that on this, I mean, there are differences, but they're sort of relatively small compared to if I want to look at heterogeneous effects of my treatment. Now there's like a bajillion different sort of things I could look at heterogeneity based on. I could look at heterogeneity based on gender, or I could look at heterogeneity based on race or a pre-period income, or you can go on and on, where you're from, or whatever. You can sort of come up with a bajillion different variables. And so as a way of sort of constraining yourself, I think people have realized that sort of that ex post looking at the heterogeneous effects of experiments, there's sort of so many dimensions there that it's really helpful to sort of constrain yourself ex ante to sort of specify kind of the few ones in advance. And you can do that either by sort of registering your study on the AEA Social Science Registry. Another way to do it is actually people like to just stratify on the things that they're gonna do ex ante heterogeneity on, ex post heterogeneity on, for two reasons. Number one, if you're actually interested in doing heterogeneity cuts on something, if you stratify on it, you make sure that you have kind of your sample kind of equally spread across the thing you're going to cut on. And number two, the fact that you sort of built it into your design is kind of like the most credible way of sort of signaling that it was something that you actually cared about ex ante. So I just wanted to sort of mention that point. Okay, so what do they find? So basically, they look at sort of a number of different measures of psychosocial well-being. PHQ is like a depression screen. They measure stress. They have some questions about life satisfaction, self-worth, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They put them together into I'm not going to go through them in detail. They put them together into sort of an average, like a average standardized index. And what you can see is that in general, sort of there's a big difference between the work treatment and the cash treatment on sort of virtually all of these measures. And they sort of allocate these. They in constructing the index, like they point everything in the right direction so that like up is always good, right? So less depression is good. So this one times -1, this one times -1, et cetera, et cetera. So in general, it looks like pretty much there's a pretty big distinction between these two different things. They look at there's some evidence that people have fewer days sick. I don't remember the cognitive score that they're using here, but they seem to do better on that. And they also sort of look at your consumption choices, and they don't seem to see substantial differences in your consumption decisions between the cash treatment and the job treatment. So the key thing here is this test, of whether the work is equal to the cash on sort of a bunch of different measures. They have like whatever, luxury consumption, necessary consumption, total savings, borrowing, and lending. So in general, like people are responding to the cash, right? They're saving more, they're borrowing less. They're even lending to sort of maybe their friends or peers or whatever. So it's not like the cash or the job had no financial impact. It's there, but you're not seeing any difference in the work versus the cash. So it doesn't look like this is really about consumption. It looks like there's something else about kind of the as you would expect probably, but it looks like there's something about the task itself which seems to be different. Yeah.
Is there any difficulty selling a paper with many outcomes like kind of subjective well-being? Is that something to actually think about?
Sorry, your question is there a problem with selling the paper where your main outcome is subjective well-being?
Yeah, is that something that you should think about, or not? Do you think it's kind of that's irrelevant?
I think it depends on the question. But I think I think it would be helpful. So one thing that's nice is they have like a whole bunch of different measures that all kind of point in the same direction. I think if it was just one measure, people might. If you had one measure and you sort of pre-specified that this is my one measure, that would be fine. But if you're sort of, the fact that they have kind of a constellation of results suggests it's not some weird thing about the way they're measuring it. It looks pretty convincing. It's like about like, no matter how you measure it, like this thing is going up.
Yeah.
So, but like, is there a problem putting subjective well-being on the left-hand side? No, I don't think so. I think it's fine.
Also, given the conversation we just had, isn't the entire point of this paper that there's some S that's not C, so you would, we need to introduce a new outcome that's not.
No, I think the point is that, is it or U, right? I mean,
yeah,
the point is that there's
introduce something that's not C.
Yes, exactly. The whole point is we're trying to measure U but not C. Exactly.
Yeah.
So you kind of have to in this paper. I agree.
Right.
Something. But I think there's a question of you could imagine the standard way psychologists measure depression with these depression screening questions. That's what they do. And I should say, by the way, one thing that can actually be helpful on this is to not reinvent the wheel and to use other metrics that are commonly accepted. So for depression, for example, there are common depression questionnaires. Like there's the PHQ-2 and the PHQ-6 and the PHQ-10, and like there's like a bunch of standard, depending on how many questions you have, there's a bunch of standard measures that psychologists have agreed on as kind of like the conventional way we measure this concept. And so if you're going to do something that's not sort of economically standard, one thing that is a good idea is to use these kind of well-established ways of measuring them. Sorry, Ed, I saw you nodding. Yeah, so I think that's like that's the one thing I would sort of say. If you're and there are, for lots and lots of these concepts, there are kind of at least generally accepted kind of ways that we measure these things, and I would just use one of those. But I think it's perfectly fine to put subjective well-being or depression or whatever on the left-hand side. Absolutely. Other questions? Okay. Let me note that the one thing, I've talked a lot about labor supply. I haven't really talked much about labor demand. And I don't really know what to say about labor demand. But I was thinking, as I was putting together my slides, I noticed that we thought a lot about the labor supply and not much about labor demand, and kind of at least in these rural settings. So I just wanted to note that in the spirit that sort of sometimes the things that we don't know are really good areas to go think about and come up with good research questions on. I just wanted to not skip this because I didn't have anything particularly interesting to say about it. Okay, that's literally all I have to say about that. Okay. The final sort of topic I want to talk about in the labor section, which I may not totally finish, but I'll get through most of, is what's going on in urban labor markets in developing countries. And I think this is also an area where I think there's been a lot of increasing sort of attention. And I want to sort of talk about I want to sort of mention these 4 themes. So one is how do we think about kind of these urban factory jobs to begin with? Are those are they good? Are they bad? How do we think about that? I just want to mention the paper on that kind of briefly. One theme that I think has come up recently is that I think is a really important kind of development economics theme is the role of the large informal sector, right? So I think one thing that differentiates urban labor markets in, say, I don't know, wherever, pick your favorite developing country city, Mumbai, compared to whatever, Boston, is the informal sector is going to be much, much larger. And that may have implications for how we think about labor market regulation, working conditions, a whole bunch of stuff. How do we think about those issues? So I want to mention a few things there. There's some interesting new work about sort of search and signaling and frictions. This is a general issue in labor markets, but sort of how do we think about, and so in a place where people may have less ability to sort of signal their skills with credentials, how do we think about kind of what's going on in those labor markets? And then finally, one issue I want to talk about is labor conditions and sort of what do we know about sort of bad working conditions in these developing country settings, and sort of what can we do about them? Okay, so that's a lot for half an hour, but let me at least try to sort of hit on a few of these themes. And what is the role of both in the working conditions kind of domestically, and also what is the role of multinationals? And I think understanding the role of multinationals here is a super interesting question. And there's one nice paper that I'll mention on it, but I think there's more to be done here. Okay, so one question people often have about kind of urban labor markets is, do people even want, how do people think about kind of different how do we think about kind of these urban kind of factory jobs? Are they do people want them? Do they not want them? How do they think about that? What's the value of a job, right? And you often hear there's a lot of kind of urban unemployment. Is that actually that people actually really want these jobs and can't get them, or is there something else kind of or maybe they want better jobs than those? How do we sort of think about that? So Blattman and Durkheim have an interesting paper where they're going to actually sort of randomize people getting these industrial jobs and sort of see what the impact of them is. So they're going to they take 1,000 applicants to entry-level jobs in 5 industrial firms in Ethiopia. most of these people were unemployed, but educated young adults, mostly women. And they're basically people who were like applying for these jobs. They wanted the jobs. The jobs were oversubscribed, and so they're going to randomize who gets the jobs. Okay, and so they have the jobs are, I think, typical kind of entry-level jobs in this context. They have about a $1 hourly wage. So a third of people get the job. A third of people go to an entrepreneurship program where they get a $300 grant. So that's equivalent to kind of like, the wage you would get for working for a year. So a pretty big grant. And a third to a control group. Okay, and they're basically just going to track what happens to these people 1 year later and then 5 years later. Okay. So that's the experiment. Okay, so what is the effect of giving people one of these jobs? So one question that I wanted to ask for you to think about is, like, how do you think about the selection of both workers and firms into this project? How does that help you think about like the results? So is my question clear? Yeah, Paolo.
It seems like the people who would choose to be in the study are people who have interest in being like self-employed and an entrepreneur, and it's comparing for that population the alternative of being an employee.
Well, so I think they're applying, yes, so they're applying to entry-level jobs. So they're selecting and actually applying to be in the entry-level jobs.
Sorry, I misunderstood.
But yes, right, sorry. So there's a selection of they want the job, actually. Sorry, Aaron.
I guess, and maybe this is related to what Paulo was mentioning, but the people who are applying to, but like, people are selecting in based on wanting to be an employee rather than like being some, so like, I guess, and maybe this is just an issue of take-up, but like people who are offered an entrepreneurship program might not like feel like they have the entrepreneurial ability, like I'd rather, work for a fixed wage at a company where my tasks are,
Right. So it may not just, so I think you're right. So it may not be just kind of the selection, like the take-up effect. It may be people take the $300, but like actually they're like, don't have any good ideas, right? Like if you offered me like money to go create a startup, like I might take the money, but like I don't have any good startup ideas. Like that's not my thing. I'm like I'm an employee person. And likewise, there may be a lot of, whereas if you went over to the Sloan School and like found people over there, like, and say like, hey, I have some money to start a startup, you might have all kinds of like great ideas, because that's kind of what they're selected on, right? So the people who are, so I agree with you, this may not be the best setting to sort of test entrepreneurship, because the people who are selected into this, they wanted a job. They didn't want like a self-employment, okay? So that's one point, I agree with that. What else might be relevant to the selection of workers here? Yeah, Christine.
Maybe since they're applying to entry-level jobs, it's a specific example of people that are okay with a job like that. But we could have other people, or type of unemployed people that maybe had an employment before and they lost it, but they are not going to settle for a job that's going to be entry-level. Yeah,
right. So these are people who actually want this particular job. That's good, right? On the other hand, you might imagine that people who have who are there might be heterogeneity in people's skill set in the population, and people who are unemployed may be sort of the lower skill, on average may have less. Of course, there's lots of reasons people are unemployed, but they may on average be, the higher skill people may be the ones who already have jobs. So they may be sort of a less useful sort of skill set. How about the selection of firms? Wes?
Is there firms who are willing to take their employees at random, or to
that's kind of weird, right?
The nature of the job is such that you don't really care who does it among your applicant pool as long as somebody does it.
Right. So that may not be the best job, right? Certainly, at MIT, we're not going to randomly hire people among all possible applicants. We have some view of what the job is, and and it may more generally be that the set of workers of firms that are completely, willing to randomize their applicant pool may not necessarily be the highest quality firms. And so I think that also may be sort of something to keep in mind too. That they may be sort of just looking to sort of fill people in, and sort of that may not be the kinds of firms that are going to really sort of for example, if you basically thought you were going to sort of have to invest a lot in kind of these people and sort of train them over many years and sort of create like a long kind of career for these people, you might be thinking more about the selection process and not be willing to randomize. So I think that those are potential. I just wanted to sort of, the point I wanted to make is that just because you do this, you do have to, the selection here could potentially be important. Yeah, Paolo.
But it seems like the answers that we got to both of these questions are, the answer to the first question means that like we're biasing the long-term outcomes, very generally speaking, of the people in the entrepreneurship program like downwards because they might not be like very interested in entrepreneurship. The second one is biasing the outcomes of the people who work and get hired also downwards because like the firm might not be that good, and so their long-term outcomes might be worse. And so it feels like, how do you think that we should like interpret as like readers whatever results?
Well, why don't you see the results, then let's come back to that question in a sec. Okay, so here are the results. So, most people who were offered the job worked at least one day. Okay, so there does seem to be a difference between the job and the entrepreneur treatment. Although note that like this is the 1 year. Was working in the study firm at Endline is only worked at least a month is only 70% of the people who were randomly offered a job, and worked at the study firm at the Endline was only 20%. So note that. And then of the people who were offered the entrepreneurship, most of them sort of take it. Okay. What they find is, so this graph, by the way, is I feel like a terrible graph because the 0 needs to be like bolded so we can see like what's positive and what's negative. I find this graph like really hard to read. But if we sort of like put the 0, with my hand here, you can see not a huge amount of sort of impacts of the job offer, except it makes your physical health like worse. Okay, so these are working in this job that seems to be bad for your health, doesn't seem to have much of an impact on your mental health, or basically kind of anything else. And the entrepreneurship program has is good for your mental health, good for your income, and kind of not much else. That's after 1 year. This is after 5 years, and after 5 years, essentially you find almost nothing. Maybe you can sort of pick out out of 20 different coefficients, maybe you have one positive, one negative. It doesn't look like there's sort of any substantial effects, and the physical effects the physical health effects basically. So no effects on kind of income. The startup also doesn't have has not huge effects. The one effect is that they're less likely to work in factory labor, and they're maybe more likely to work in medium skilled labor, but kind of not very much. And in terms of the physical health and the mental health effects, kind of those all go away after 5 years. And so actually, in some sense, to answer your question, I kind of feel like one of the challenges of this study is that like we sort of thought there were reasons that you might not find huge effects of either of them, and that's kind of what they find, right? That sort of people get these jobs, they kind of leave them. The jobs are pretty unpleasant. They're bad for their health. Most of them leave, and then kind of things go back to normal. And the entrepreneurship program doesn't seem particularly successful here. I think not to say that all entrepreneurship programs aren't successful, but maybe sort of this wasn't necessarily the best sort of pool to try them. So I think of this paper was, I think, influential because it was one of the first papers to sort of study what is the impact of giving someone one of these kind of factory jobs. But I do think that sort of these sample selection issues are important to sort of think through in terms of how we sort of interpret the effects, and it's not sort of the final word on that. But I think it's a very well done study, and I think sort of like actually following these people for 5 years is actually, I think, really very hard and I think very commendable in terms of actually sort of being able to figure out what these things were. And part of this also may be sort of reflecting kind of that we're in kind of an equilibrium in the labor market where actually kind of like people get these jobs, they cannot get these jobs, they're not super duper scarce, and so sort of randomizing you to get one may not kind of affect your long run outcomes, because if you didn't get one, maybe you'll eventually end up somewhere similar. Okay, questions? Yeah.
I have a quick question about the logic for including the entrepreneurship treatment.
Yeah.
So I get that one potential idea is that you want to have some sense of what the possible counterfactuals are to not getting this factory job, but it seems to me that what most people who don't get this factory job will do is just apply to a different one. So, since my control group isn't I can't force you to not work.
Well, it turns out that's not true, actually. So, oh, so sorry, I take it back. It is actually true. So you're right. So if you look at sort of like well, I mean, so that's kind of what this first stage is about, right? So did you work in the formal sector for a month? So that goes, or at least a month. That does, you're right, it's 69% in the control group. So it's high. It does go up by 90%. So to 90%. So the first stage is like 30 percentage points. You know, were you working in any, worked at least a month in any industrial firm? Again, goes up by, you know, double. So it's high in the control group, but there is sort of still a first stage. Other questions? Okay. The second thing I wanted to talk about is the role of the informal sector, and you know, labor regulation kind of more generally. So there's a paper by Besley and Burgess that looks at sort of like overall labor regulation in India using kind of a state-by-year difference in difference. And the finding of this paper is more, quote, pro-worker policies actually lower output and lower formal employment and may even increase poverty. And the trade-off they're trying to highlight is that, you know, as you make, in a case where sort of there's, you know, firms can choose to locate in different places, there may be a trade-off between sort of getting more protections for the existing set of workers on the one hand, but sort of discouraging kind of like, you know, firms from locating there and sort of firm growth happening in kind of other places as well. That's going to depend on both whether those things, on both whether these policies have like direct costs on any firm, and in particular if there are sort of firm location decisions and firms are more elastic, then those effects could be kind of larger. I think this paper is, was sort of an important earlier paper. It's a little coarse in terms of, if you actually look at it, what it does, they basically kind of code up policies as like 1 for its pro-worker, -1 if it's anti-worker, and it's kind of a state-level diff and diff. It doesn't necessarily sort of shed a lot of detail onto sort of what's happening, but I think it's an important, at least hypothesis to sort of think about. What are firms doing to kind of like, you know, given these regulations? So I have a paper which sort of looks, among other things, at the idea that many firm regulations kick in at particular thresholds. So in India, for example, if your firm has 100 employees, all kinds of additional regulations kick in. So we ask sort of whether you see firms kind of like avoiding these regulations, and you see kind of like, and in particular, we just look at the density of firms and look at whether they're sort of bunching at firms kind of just below 100. If that was true, you might imagine they would grow up to 100 and then sort of stop, right? And it is true, if you look at informal firms, you do see excess mass kind of right at, you know, 98 employees or whatever. So there's some kind of distortionary activity there. But it's really small. So we estimate that like this additional bunching over here is like 400 firms in all of India. So it's not sort of a big effect, yeah.
Do you observe informal firms?
From I think it's from the NSS, the National Sample Survey has like a module that sort of does this in certain years. In general, so you can observe. So I think that's how we do it in India. In other contexts, some countries will do firm censuses, where they will actually literally go door to door and count every single firm, regardless of sort of whether or not it's formal or not.
India has that too. Oh, is that what we're doing in this one? They stopped asking that question in like the 1990s.
Okay, so it's not that. It's embarrassing that I don't remember exactly which survey it is. I think it's from I think we did it from the NSS. There's a special module in the NSS. But there are some countries just count informal firms directly.
I still don't understand why, like informal firms wouldn't be I would assume they wouldn't be impacted by the legal system coming in at employment of 100 because they are not observed to begin with.
Yeah, that's also a good point, right? You might imagine that. So I agree with you. You imagine this effect will be sort of bigger at 100. But you know, maybe that sort of they might, you know, become more formalized. They might become formalized. The workers might sort of, you know, ask them to do this. I agree with you. It's the point of this actually is not to show bunching. It's to show there's not much bunching. Is kind of the main point.
it's also amazing that there are informal firms with 120 employed people, because like my understanding of informal firms was like they are usually small so that they cannot be detected. But if you're 100, if you have 100 employees, how are they not like detected?
You know, Rashan, sorry, you have. It's a good question, but you know, I think that there should, you know, it's a question of detection and sort of making you formally register and all that stuff. I agree with you. The larger you get, the more likely you are to be formal. But I think that it's I agree with you actually. It's I hadn't actually thought that question that way, but I think you're right. It's surprising, but it's certainly in the data. Yeah. Sure.
Are these percentages of like all the y-axis percentages of all firms in the economy?
Yes, and so there's a. Well, so this is of all the firms in the economy, and this is the of all the formal firms and all the informal firms. This is very, very small. What's happening is like most of the firms have like a small number of employees. So that's why I'm saying this is like 400 firms in all of India, like over here, because it's like 0.0404 times the whole thing. If you actually, in the paper, we also have this non-zoomed out, and like if I put all the way to 0 on the x-axis, you wouldn't see anything here. It's like looks like that. That's also the paper. Okay. What's going on is, so there's a paper by Bertrand et al. Which basically says that what's happening is that basically firms are trying to get around some of these constraints through outsourcing. Okay, and so what they do is, in particular, so it's also not quite precise at 100 because firms are the exact kind of like your exact, this idea that we should look for sort of bunching right at 100. Firms may have shocks. They kind of may go from one to another. They may hire or fire from year to year. But what you can see is that sort of this is the probability they're sort of hiring contract workers or having any contract workers or having contract workers greater than 50% of their employment. What you can see is that basically this is really sort of increasing kind of as you get kind of like, the small firms aren't doing it, and it's kind of getting closer sort of as you get closer to this threshold. And as you sort of become large, like firms are actually having some non-trivial share of their workers be hired as contract workers as a way of sort of potentially evading some of these, not evading, or sort of avoiding some of these employment regulations. And actually, we have a job market candidate on the market this year who's actually studying in Brazil sort of what are the implications of sort of allowing this kind of outsourcing on workers in the Brazilian security guard industry. Sorry, I mentioned that. The final thing I want to mention on informal firms, so I'm going to take maybe 2 more minutes and sort of talk about this, because I think this is pretty fascinating, is are there sort of spillovers from regulations in the formal sector to what's happening in the informal sector? And this maybe get a little bit of your question of like, why would there be a spike at 100 or something? Is there anything sort of spilling over from the formal sector to the informal sector? And in particular, this paper by Durenencourt is not really about this, but what I actually think is the most interesting finding from this paper is that there seem to be spillovers from formal sector minimum wages to wages that are happening in the informal sector. And that's not totally crazy if we think there's sort of a labor market out there that maybe that could be sort of what's driving that. But it suggests actually that you may have thought that sort of some of these labor market regulations like minimum wages wouldn't have any bite in a place with a large informal sector because those firms wouldn't be affected by that. And this paper suggests that's not right. So in particular, the way they get this data, by the way, is they have household survey data, and they're going to look at sort of at whether you're employed in a formal. So they're looking at from the household side of like what your wage is, and looking at sort of what kind of firm you're employed in. And here's the kind of the key point here. So this is your monthly wage. This is the minimum wage. The light, these dots here are the sort of are in the informal sector, and these are in the formal sector. So nobody in the formal sector is earning below the minimum wage. But what I think, and some people are earning below the minimum wage in the informal sector. But what I think is kind of remarkable is there's this massive spike right at the minimum wage. And that's true in the informal sector as well as in the formal sector. And in fact, when they look at sort of, this is probably too small, but it's in your handout, as you sort of see so this is kind of the main point I wanted to make, What I was hoping they would have is a similar graph. They actually have changes in the minimum wage over time. The version of the paper that I saw did not have the informal sector over time showing how the informal sector wage changes as they raise the formal minimum wage. So I suggested that they do that. I think this would be really nice. Because I think if they could sort of show you that the formal minimum wage is kind of following the kind of the informal minimum wage is following the formal minimum wage, I think that would be pretty remarkable and sort of show that that these formal sector regulations are sort of carrying over to the informal sector as well. And more generally, sort of understanding what are the spillovers from sort of the formal sector to the informal sector is like we sort of have this assumption that kind of in the informal sector anything goes, but sort of understanding and sort of probing that in more detail, I think is really important. Yeah, Ahmed. You have a question?
From a model perspective, if workers are capable of searching for jobs in both informal and formal sectors,
yeah,
any effect on the formal sector should have it.
It depends. It depends on what you think of as the model. So if the minimum wage is too high, like if it depends, if it's in a minimum wage model, right? If the minimum wage is above kind of the market clearing wage, then it wouldn't necessarily, like it's not necessarily clear it would have spillover effects to the informal sector because there's sort of there's like a shortage of jobs at the kind of there's like queuing for jobs at the minimum wage. See what I'm saying? Like everyone who would want a job at the minimum wage can't get one. It depends on what your model looks like. You see what I'm saying? Like if the formal sector looks like this, right? And we put a minimum wage up here, right? And we're over here. There's all these people who would like jobs over here at the minimum wage that can't get one. And so, those people could, may just instead prefer to just take a job with the informal sector at the market clearing wage.
But maybe that increases the informal sector's market clearing wage if like there's enough of them.
Yeah, it may, right? So you could write down a model in which it could. For example, some of these people over here may decide to queue for and wait around to get one of these higher minimum wage jobs, and that may sort of like decrease the sort of number of people who are willing to go take these other jobs, and they may have to sort of bid up their wages in expectation. I think that simple model, by the way, wouldn't get you that the informal sector is paying the exact same wage, right? It would increase the informal sector's wage, but it wouldn't go all the way because your choice would be sort of I go to the informal sector. Like the indifference condition would be sort of I queue for the formal sector job or I take the informal sector job now, right? So that would be there should still be a discount. But you're right, there could be spillovers, but I think there should still be a discount. But nevertheless, I guess anyway, I found this graph like totally striking, and I think that sort of understanding more generally like what those spillovers between formal and informal sector looks like is a really interesting area to do more work on. So I'm totally out of time, so I'll stop now. I may say a few more things about labor at the beginning of next class, but mostly I'm going to talk about credit next week. So do the credit reading on the syllabus.